like a narrative that is our story, and that eventually he kind of comes full circle a bit, because the whole use of identity is it's helpful for us for organizing information. And so this is kind of the main thrust of why we have an illusion of self, is that it helps us organize information faster as it relates to ourselves, because we do not need to store every chaotic piece of information. We just need to store the narratives of our lives and our relationships. And this is our identity, or our self-story. The second is the Machiavellian baby. So he talks about developmental stuff, also like what the baby, like how babies interact. Like one thing is that I'm actually not 100% sure if he discusses this in the book, but like often when a child is hurt, they will not determine that they are hurt on their own. What they'll instead do is they run, they fall down, and then they look at mom. And if the mom, like, if her reaction is she's horrified, then the baby starts crying. If the mom is nonchalant and doesn't care, then the baby continues on his merry way. And so this is an instance where, like, the baby is, like, learning socially how to interpret its own reality. I don't think this is actually in the book, but it's kind of thematically similar to what the stuff he talks about is. He talks about how we learn socially as children developmentally. He talks about how if we are not like socialized, we don't really develop properly. There's a few studies on this. There's this orphanage study that was done in Romania, where they had an orphanage that had way too many babies per caretaker, basically, and how this developmentally stunted the kids on like a permanent basis. And so he's talking about how our developmental factors are going to greatly influence who we are later. And he uses this is like kind of some of the weaker like tie-ins to identity, but the argument is that it's not like some essential element that makes us us, but it's our like past conditioning and stuff. Okay, then he talks about the looking glass self, which I actually think is the most interesting thing in the book. And the idea is that we do not have like a singular identity. Instead, we have like a contextual, socially constructed identity. And the way the looking glass self model works is that we do not construct our sense of identity based on like who we think we are. Instead, it is constructed by thinking who we think. Is constructed socially, so there's an essential element of being watched. And when we see others seeing us, we construct our identity based on what we think that they think we are, or who they think they think we are. And so a good example for this is how malleable our identities seem to be. Like, a lot of people are way different with their parents than they are with like their friends or coworkers. And what they argue is they're just behaving different. But what the looking glass self argues is that the identity actually shifts. And he argues why our choices are not our own, and the cost of free will. These two chapters both kind of talk a lot about free will. And this is like a very important philosophical concept as far as identity goes. But Yeah, so the way it works is that he basically denies kind of the existence of free will and talks about how free will is mostly like an illusion, and it's like an essential illusion. He references, for example, studies that show that when people are primed with a story about free will, how they will perform more persistently on a task or cheat less on a test. There's a few studies like this, and so he argues that the illusion of free will is an important thing for us in terms of it's a useful thing, but it's not an accurate description of what's going on, but it's still like an essential part of the self-illusion. It's a little like tangential to identity itself, but it's thematically similar in that it's the same type of thing that we are deceiving ourselves for some utility. And so in that regard, it like belongs together. Let's see. 6 is How the Tribe Made Me. I think this is the chapter where he talks about Zimbardo's prison experiment, which I recently covered on a study Sunday. In the experiment, what happens is there's a roundup of a bunch of psychology students, and they are fake arrested and put in a fake prison, and the fake prison guards are other psychology students, and they're like looking to see what happens, and they kind of like slip into their roles, and the prisoners become, or the prison guards become sadistic and cruel to the prisoners, and the prisoners become defiant to the prison guards, and it's really not this like it very quickly loses its character, like its tenor of being like this made up sort of experiment, and quickly starts to look very real to the people who are in it, and it is considered an experiment that would be unethical to run today, and its results are considered to be rather horrifying, the way in which the prison guards like humiliated and dehumanized the prisoners. And the reason why it's relevant to this sort of identity discussion is that Bruce Hood argues that if who we are is so like susceptible to change just based on us having a different social role, then who we are isn't really that grounded. And it's just the feeling of being grounded is really just part of the illusion. And we just feel like we have this grounded sense of self, but if we had just a different role or a different identity, it could dramatically shift. Another study, I think he cites it in here, that's similar along these lines is the Milgram experiment, where an experimenter has someone, so the person who's being tested is the teacher, and another fake person being tested, they're not really a person being tested, is the learner. And what they have to do is they have to answer questions. When they get the questions wrong, they get shocked by the teacher, and the shocks get stronger and stronger and stronger. And the question is will the teacher deliver shocks that look like they are causing very serious harm to the learner, just by being instructed to by the lab coat person. And so this type of thing was kind of set up as a sort of, test to kind of look at I was just following orders defense of like the SS and the Nazis and this sort of thing. And like at the start, I think they predicted like 3% of people would go to the max shock, and there was no way that like a large percentage would go to the max shock, and like a full 2/3 delivered the highest level shock. And I think the shock goes up to 450, and at like 375, the respondent stops. The learner stops responding entirely. So it looks like, from the perspective of the teacher, who's the actual person who's being tested in the experiment, it looks as if the person is actually just dead or unconscious. And like they kept going higher and higher and higher, because a failure to answer is considered an incorrect answer to the test. And so it's just this like situation where it was a very shocking like result for the study, especially because everyone guessed it would just be like 2 to 3%. I think 3% was the average guess of how many people they thought would get to the highest shock, because they thought this was just crazy, like no one would be this compliant. But 2/3 got to the end. Okay, so the next chapter is The Stories We Live By. This is kind of delving into how it's useful to us to have this sense of self and identity, where because it helps us give coherence to our lives in a way that would not be possible. And it just kind of weaves our entire lives and everything around it into a narrative that's easy to make sense of. And so it's just, identity is just part of the story that helps make life coherent. The next chapter is Caught in the Web, where he talks about like modern technology, or relatively modern at the time of this book, and social media. It's come a long way since then, so like, okay. And then Why You Can't See Yourself in the Reflection is kind of a conclusion, where he talks about why is this illusion that there is really no essential sense of self, why is it so persistent, and why we can't shake it even in the face of evidence that our sense of selves is not really, let's say, legitimate, I guess. And okay, like, overall, what I really, really liked about the book is I think the selection of studies overall is really strong. If I like had to select a book, or if I had to select two books, and these were the only two books I could know about any of the psychological studies in the books, this might be one of them, and the other one would be Thinking Fast and Slow. But again, it just kind of reads a little bit like just a bombardment of talking about the study, giving a brief like blurb as to why it's relevant, talking about another study, brief blurb, and I don't think he does a particularly good job like tying it all together. Like, obviously he does it to some extent, but I just think that he misses the mark. And so let's get into the ratings. So for utility, I gave it a 3.5. He doesn't offer too much in the way of like recommendations on the basis of like this illusion and like what's going on. I don't think, in terms of practicality, knowing about these things might not be so useful. So I scored it kind of low. As far as novelty goes, I did score it a 9 because I think, so first of all, I think there's like a lot of really good and interesting studies in here. And because of that, and they're like all back to back to back. And so because of that, I think it's a good read, just like on the basis of if you haven't read a book about psychology at all, and you haven't heard of any of these studies, hearing about a lot of these studies, I think would just be an incredibly useful thing. Maybe utility should have been higher. It's tough. I think that. So there's like this distinction between like practical utility and like theoretical utility or something like this, maybe to be made here, where it's maybe not practically very useful, but in terms of like theoretical utility, I think knowing about a lot of these studies is important. And so I scored it high on novelty, not necessarily because it's hard to like read about these studies, because a lot of psychology books reference various ones of these studies, but it's just a very dense amalgamation of these studies. And so in terms of like finding a lot of studies that are worth reading about or knowing about, because I think like some of them have like huge effects. Like the Zimbardo one I think is like really good, although that's in just about every psychology book, so that's maybe not a good example. But yeah, I scored it quite high for novelty. This book was weird because I have mixed feelings on this book, and so like doing the ratings was actually pretty difficult for me. For entertainment, I gave it a 5.5. The writing style, as far as being engaging, it's pretty good. And then also it's also very interesting, and it's because the book is interesting, it makes it entertaining. Probably more so than the writing style being entertaining. There's no narrative structure or anything like that, and so like that's not a source of the entertainment. So I gave it just like a pip above, kind of a midline type of thing. Maybe that was a little generous, maybe not. I don't know. For style, I gave it a 3.5. I did not think that the author did so the writing style is not for like the prose itself, but is for the organization of the book and what I've already complained about, which is that I think that the author does a poor job of organizing the ideas into a overarching like type of argument, which he seems to try and be making, because he's arguing that the self is an illusion, and I don't think he like brings it back to his main point well enough or strongly enough, or has like any really, like, it's just study to study to study to study to study. And you know, I'm reading another book on identity right now, which is perhaps why I am frustrated with this guy a little bit, where this guy comes from a psychological background, the other guy comes from a philosophical background, and so maybe I'm just, you know, I just have too high a bar to set for this, like, organization type thing. But okay, I gave it a 3.5. The 3.5 is not on the back of the prose being terrible. It's on the back of, like, the overarching argument not being so good. Readability, I gave it a 6.5. It's easy to read. And I think that, yeah, I mean, it's approachable. Maybe a 6 would have been a better rating. I'm not sure. I think that the author made accessible a large amount of studies, and, like, some of the concepts are a little bit difficult, and I think that he talked about them in a way that was, like, easy to get at. You know, like, some of the free will arguments and, like, discussions are, like, a bit in the weeds, and not super, but, like, I think he did a good job. And then for interesting, I gave it a 9, largely because it's, like, a collection of a lot of studies I find incredibly interesting / important. You know, so as far as recommendations go, I would actually pretty broadly recommend this book. I think that the part about the book I found annoying was the lack of overarching organization, which I don't think is necessarily something that a lot of other people would have a problem with. And so what you're left with is, like, actually a pretty good collection of studies that relate to identity and the self, which is, like, kind of something that's relevant to everyone. So I'd actually recommend this book quite broadly, I think, and more broadly than its overall rating of a 6.17 might suggest. Yeah, I would... just very broadly, obviously, if identity's interesting to you, I would, like, slam dunk recommend, but just other than that, also quite broad. Like, if you're interested in psychology and you haven't read that many studies or types of things, this might be one that I would recommend pretty high up there, just as a general interest in psychology, just trying to get into psychology a little bit, because I think that it's got a lot of interesting things. And I also think that, like, there's a lot of stuff that, like, psychology talks about where people are just very, like, they just really, really don't understand, like, some spots where the evidence is just deeply incongruous with people's intuitions. Like, a good example of this is, like, eyewitness testimony is just extremely unreliable, but people consider it to be extremely reliable. And it's unreliable because your memories aren't really memories. They're not... Most people think of memories as, like, a video recording. And this book even talks about this one, I think. If I recall correctly. Which, who knows? You know, because memory's unreliable. But the thing with... People think it's like a video recording. And it's not a video recording. It's a reconstruction, and it's reconstructed every time. And so it's really unreliable and extremely susceptible to like, influence. And so, like, there's one where I can't remember exactly how it went, and I appreciate the irony of this. It's something to the effect of, did the white sedan stop at the stop sign? Or the people have to ask, the people watch a car accident, and then they are later asked a question, and then, like, a week later or something, they're tested, and, like, the question they get asked is, did the white car stop at the stop sign, or something like this? And either the car wasn't white, or the stop sign, there was no stop sign, but a week later, when recounting the event, they'll insist that the car was white, or there was a stop sign, or whatever it is, and it's just the priming of the question about it that leads them to insist that they saw it. And not only do they insist that they saw it, they really believe that they saw it because the memory is reconstructed, and so they have an actual memory of this happening, And because, look, if someone asks you if the white car stopped at the stop sign, a general heuristic is that it's pretty reasonable to believe that both there was a stop sign and there was a white car, right? And so your brain just automatically like refills this and redoes it, except you don't know that it's refilling and redoing it, right? You don't know that it's like reconstructing the memory in a particular way on the basis of being asked a particular question. You just think that the memory is this perfectly encoded video. And so, but it's not, and it's just really unreliable. And so eyewitness testimony is like the worst form of evidence, just in terms of like its empirical like standing, because you'll get a lot of police officers being, or this is the way it used to be. They have like new procedures now, but like, you know, you would put someone in a lineup of 6 people, and the police officers know who they want you to like grab, and then you'd point out a guy, and then the police officer would ask, if you didn't point out the guy they wanted, they'd be like, are you sure? You know, and then the person would be like, oh, I'm not really sure, I'll take another look. And like the memories would get reconstructed and distorted, and it's like there's a ton of people have been exonerated post like eyewitness testimony looking bad, and then they get like DNA evidence. And it's not that it's like completely useless as far as evidence goes, but it's really bad and unreliable, and people act like it's really reliable, and it's not. And so this is the eyewitness testimony, to make a long point short, is an example of something that humans are really bad at, but they think they're good at. And there's a lot of these in psychology, and I think that knowing about them like really matters, and that this book in particular talks about a lot of them. Like, for example, the Zimbardo experiment, a lot of people were like, if you ask them, oh, if you were an SS officer, would you like be bad to the Jews? And then everyone's always like, no, I wouldn't, because, you know, I wouldn't abuse my power, and then like I wouldn't conform. And then you look at the Milgram experiment and the Zimbardo experiment, and they just took a bunch of normal Stanford students that were like well-adjusted and no psychological history of like trauma or like bad stuff, and they just turned into these like horrible sadists in the span of a week, even though they knew that the people that they were with were just other students, you know. And so it's like, well, how could you know that you wouldn't turn into this like abusive like officer if you were just made like an SS prison warden? And the answer is you don't. But people, because they want to have this like particular sense of self or identity, they want to be so sure that they wouldn't, and it's an important part of the story they tell themselves about themselves. But the answer is you can't really know. And not only can you not really know, if you also look at the Milgram experiment, where people basically just followed orders, everyone thought that they wouldn't follow orders, just basically killing someone in a psychological experiment. They're like, only 3% will go to the end, and 2/3 went to the end. You know, it's like, there's this deep disconnect behind like the predictions and the outcomes when it comes to both how your identity or sense of self or the role you play in society informs like how much of a dick you can be, like in the case of the Zimbardo experiment, and also just how big a factor can someone just telling you to like follow orders or whatever be in the sense of the Milgram experiment. In the Milgram experiment, there was no coercion or like no threat of force or anything like this, which was not the case with the Nazis. And so it's you know, the initial intent when they talked about the Milgram experiment, and I'm probably going to cover the Milgram experiment later, so maybe I shouldn't talk about it now, but the original intent was that they were doing this study in the United States as a bit of a control, and then they were planning on doing it in Germany. And the idea was they wanted to see how resilient the people in the United States were before they tested how horrible the people in Germany were, because they knew the people in Germany just had to be these horrible conformists in order to be part of the Nazi experiment. And so the America was supposed to be a control, you know. And then they found the Americans were as horrible as they thought the Nazis were, so they're like, oh, I guess we don't need to test the Germans. And so it's this thing where, like in the case of identity, we think that this is something that's solid and concrete, and it's not. It's not at all. And this book talks a lot about that, and it uses a lot of studies that I think are revealing in terms of who we are in ways that we would not expect. One of them, if I remember correctly, is the unreliability of memories. Like another is the Zimbardo experiment, the Milgram experiment, which I think is covered in this book, but I'm not sure. Again, memories are unreliable. And so I think that this is a very strong book overall. That as far as recommendations go, I would recommend it like probably at like a frequency that's like more akin to like being in the low 7s than being in the low 6s. I just thought that something just rubbed me the wrong way about this book. That like I am aware that like it might not be fair that the way in which it rubbed me the wrong way, but it did, and so like the ratings reflect that. But yeah, as far as discussion goes, does anyone have a favorite psychology study in regards to like being surprising about something, or revealing something that people intuitively get really wrong? Kind of like what I've discussed with the memory and the conformity and these types of things. And also, if you like this video, feel free to give it a like, subscribe, or share it with a friend. Any of the YouTube algorithm stuff. And also have a good day. I click stop recording. That means...